Thank you for staying with us all the while. Well, the Israel-Palestine conflict continues unabated, it would seem, with Israel's Prime Minister quoted as saying the war in Gaza is going to be long. But you see, Nigeria and more than 100 other UN member states have voted for immediate humanitarian truce in Gaza. What does this imply? Because Gaza's health ministry says the death toll among Palestinians in the Hamas-Israel conflict has crossed, depending on whose figures you're looking at, between 8,000 and 9,000. Most of them, unfortunately, women and minors. Professor Femi Otunbanjo joins us this morning. He is a research professor of international relations and strategic studies at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Do you even think, first of all, generally, there are calls, depending on whose interest is at risk? Exactly, do you think people even understand what the issues are? It's been on for decades.
Yes, it's the world's most intractable conflict. It's been on since 1948, 75 years, when the British trustee mandate was ended in what was formerly part of the Ottoman Empire. And two states were created by resolution of the United Nations, 181. But the state of Israel for the Jews and Palestinian for the Arabs. But the Arabs rejected it. They rejected the idea of creating Israel within their own territory and have continued to reject it. They have fought several wars, and unfortunately, those wars ended up entrenching Israel rather than fulfilling the objective of removing Israel. And we are still at it. It is a clash of nationalisms. There's a lot of history which anybody can tell. History sometimes is the account of the victor. But really, we have Palestinian nationalism versus Jewish nationalism clashing. And the world has not been able to find a way of separating them because everybody is taking some kind of has some kind of interest in the matter. For 75 years, the world has tried to solve the problem, but it's not been resolved. And this particular one is a response. This particular outbreak of violence is a response by Hamas to what you call the Abraham Accords that the United States has been mentoring between some Arab countries. A few of them, Bahrain, UAE, Morocco, and Sudan have signed some kind of accord. But interestingly, those accords, the content did not mention Palestine once. And that means that the Palestinians are being sidelined, being forgotten. And I think Hamas is trying to remind the world that the Palestinian problem remains and has not been solved, and therefore trying to discredit that accord. And it's done so, it's doing so effectively, because it knows it has dragged Israel into a quagmire. Israel is in a quagmire. Israel has already lost the public opinion, the international opinion, the propaganda war. And it's going to be dragged into a dangerous urban warfare. It's okay for Israel to drop all these bombs from the air. By the time you enter Gaza, it's a different ballgame. And there's no amount of power. The Nazis tried it in the siege of Stalingrad, sent their best troops and all that. They were destroyed. So I think Israel will not have an advantage in a ground war. And the alternative is to now destroy from the air. And that destruction will be shown to the world. The world will resent it because it is indiscriminate destruction of both military and civilian, killing women, old people, and so on.
But isn't that the way Hamas even started in the first place?
Yes.
You know, air raid and all of that,
yes.
which jeopardized the lives of Israel.
Yes, quite honestly, my idea is not to blame one side or the other, but the truth of the matter is that in the human psychology, I mean, the Yoruba say, when the fly is biting, is flying all over you, nobody talks. But when they see you eating flies, that is the reality. When Hamas went, of course, people condemned it.
Okay.
But what they are seeing is a disproportionate response. Israel is threatening to destroy Hamas, which is an unrealizable objective, which is political hot air. It's not a military objective that can be realized, but it can be realized at the expense of the massive destruction of Gaza, which would totally alienate Israel from the rest of the world, mobilize Arab opinion and international opinion against it, and they make the old objective of fighting to be unrealizable.
It's very interesting that these things, I mean, the way you are putting these things, but, even the attempts that have been made, beyond that, of the United Nations, the truce and everything that was called, I also remember that there was that handshake between Palestine, not Hamas, Palestine and Israel in the days of Yasser Arafat when Bill Clinton was president.
Yes.
He invited them and they had this conversation, they had a handshake and all those things.
Menachem Begin was the Prime Minister of Israel.
I'm wondering how, for God's sake, were we able to circumvent that kind of process, because the whole world cheered at that time that if the two leaders could look each other in the eye and have a handshake. This was in 1993. How many years ago now? 30 years ago now?
Yes.
One would have expected that would have been it.
Yes. Well, the reality is that Hamas' ideology is that of destruction of Israel.
So that is not the ideology of Palestine.
That's the decision you want to make. It's not the ideology of the Palestinian people. But democratically, Hamas was elected to control Gaza, whereas Mahmoud Abbas, Fatah, controls the West Bank. In fact, the moderate Mahmoud Abbas faction was thrown out of Gaza through violence and military victory of Hamas. So essentially, Israel sees Hamas as a terrorist group that is actually explicitly devoted to its destruction. So Israel is not going to be comfortable. The destruction of Israel is the objective of Hamas and groups like Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad. How do you negotiate that kind of polar objectives in which Israel wants to survive and has the right to survive? Hamas wants to destroy it. Hamas is not just content with creating a Palestinian state. It goes beyond that objective. And that is where the problem is. Mahmoud Abbas' faction has become almost helpless in the matter.
So how did Hamas itself, come to be? Because in all of the conversations since 1948 that you mentioned, even as far back as just about 30 years ago, 1993, I'm not sure that Hamas is as prominent in the scheme
because
of things.
Hamas is the product of a split in the Palestinian liberation movement. There have been a lot of infighting. People with different perspectives. You remember how Sadat was assassinated because he signed a peace treaty with Egypt. That is the kind of ideological conflict that you find within any organization. And then, of course, it leads to fractionalization. And Hamas grew out of that disenchantment with the options that the PLO was offering and created his own extremist commitment to destroy Israel, as opposed to Mahmoud Abbas' Fatah, which really was ready to compromise.
So where do we go from here, Prof?
Yeah.
What are the... Because it seems like even political solutions are failing.
Yes.
So where do we go from here?
Well, there's nothing. We have to go back to political solutions, because first, you cannot solve this problem through the military option. If you take over the whole of Gaza, then you still have the West Bank. That means you will increase militancy in the West Bank, which, of course, might be taken over by Hamas. If Hamas cannot defeat Israel, let us not make any mistake about that. Israel may be able to destroy, but it cannot destroy. It will be able to destroy physically the environment of Gaza and all that through bombardments and all that. But it cannot destroy the ideology. And ideology is not something you shoot down. Yeah. So how do you go about it? The whole world has to be involved. The Arab League has not done the best that it should do. In fact, because it has the Arab world is filled with all these feudalistic, autocratic governments that are very fragile and depend on basically the United States for survival. They have not been able to put pressure on these terrorist groups, or what we call liberation groups. I don't think we should be fair to call them terrorists because they are nationalist groups as well. They might adopt terror tactics to come to some kind of accommodation. Israel's greatest fear is that an independent Palestine will be controlled by Hamas. It will be taken over by Hamas, and Hamas, that is committed to destroying it, will then have some kind of leeway to do so. Well,
you put it quite fairly when you said the Hamas is not just a physical infrastructure or people. It's an ideology.
It's an ideology, yes.
Now, this ideology is extreme.
Yes.
But then it is also interesting that this ideology, one way or the other, is getting some kind of sentimental support. But it's also, cheering to know that Nigeria has taken the position of humanitarian perspectives. Professor Bolaji Akinyemi has suggested that Nigeria should remain neutral in all of this and not take sides.
Yes.
Do you agree with him?
Yes. Well, there's no side to take. Because a lot of Nigerians think that it's a religious thing. There's only 1.6% of Christians in Israel. There are more Muslims. There are 21% of Muslims, Palestinian Muslims in Israel, the state of Israel. So it is not about religion. It's about working out and accommodate. The Palestinians deserve freedom. They deserve their own human rights. They deserve to have a state. Israel deserves to survive. You have to balance this. How do you do it? You have to remove all these powers. In fact, it is a clash of powers, sometimes a clash of civilization. And all these Saudi Arabia and Iran regional powers who are sponsoring all this violence, the United States that supplies all the weapons and continues to oil its own military industrial complex, the Jewish lobby that it wants to satisfy. There are too many factors. But the two-state solution, there's no alternative to it.
But this two-state solution conversation has been on, as you said, since 1948.
Yes.
75 years, you said.
Yeah, it was in fact the initial solution because the United Nations wanted to create Israel and a Palestinian state. When the Arabs rejected it and started fighting until Israel took over those territories that should have formed the nucleus of a Palestinian state. The problem with the two-state solution so far is that even Fatah, which is the moderate faction of Mahmoud Abbas, is saying that Israel must be a binational state. So, whereas you have one state for the Palestinians, you are going to have a state in which the Palestinians are integral part. They are even seeking the right of return, what they call the right of return, that Palestinians can return to Israel. And of course, that would dilute the Jewishness of the Israelis, and Israelites are not interested in that. There's also the problem of how can you reform Hamas? If you have an independent Palestinian state, can you keep out Hamas from taking over power? And if it takes over power, will it still be committed to the destruction of Israel?
Questions.
Yes.
I thought you were coming to ask questions, but clearly the questions are limitless.
Yes.
And we can only hope that, as time goes by, these issues will be resolved. We'll keep our eyes on them and probably have you some other time to discuss this.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thank you for asking me.
Is a research professor of international relations and strategic studies at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs in Lagos.